Our commentator is Sophia ROSENFELD from the University of Virginia, who's the author of A Revolution in Language, The Problem of Science in Late 18th Century France, and Common Sense, A Political History, which has just been published in French as well, and who is currently working on a new book on the history of choice making.
Thank you very much. I will try to be brief because I want to save some time here. So let me cut to the chase and say to begin that this was a remarkably easy task to comment on these papers because they are extremely rich and they are extremely stylish. And rarely does one get three such papers that seem to be written actually in conversation with each other, a bit by accident, since that wasn't really the plan, I don't think. All of them are focused, obviously, on the singular individual, what Malcolm Gladwell would call an outlier, which is to say the genius, the celebrity, the overachiever, the innovator. And I suppose this isn't so surprising in that we're in an era in which these kinds of people are more objects of fascination than ever before. 30 years ago, we might all be gathered in this room, you know, at 8:30 on a Sunday morning, and talking more likely about a different set of related types. Maybe we would have been talking about the peasant, the servant, the mendicant, the prostitute, or if we're talking about ideas, maybe we'd be talking about the Grub Street hack or the parish priest. And I think I did a quick look through the program and saw, you know, no panel out of scores of them on the peasantry, for instance, at French, which is rather amazing. But the interest in these papers lies in the fact that they all use the exploration of this particular social type, the outlier, defined by its elevated status as a way to explore the larger tensions and stresses in the social world or particularly the social imaginary of the late 18th and into the early 19th century. A world that in some ways is ever more conceptually horizontal and in some ways is ever more stratified in practice and in theory by wealth, by gender, by talent, by, in the language of 1789, social utility, and that's ever more the product of mediated rather than direct social relations. In other words, a world that looks a little bit like our own. And I take all three of these papers in some sense to be commenting less on the distinctiveness of French culture than on modernity by using essentially the late 18th century to stand for, in some ways, the world we've inherited. And in trying to talk about genius or celebrity as parts of either real or imagined social relations, these papers all necessarily, either explicitly or implicitly, take up certain questions of method, about how to think of the social position, in particular of the exceptional writer, when our access to that figure is through the words of the exceptional writer. And that's really true in all three cases. Nevertheless, there are some points of stress or tension between the papers, both at the level of argument and at the level of method. So let me try to very briefly draw out what those might be, and then really both retreat and return to Tony's question. Tony did my work for me by posing the question, how do we put these things together? So that's where we'll return to. So let me start with Darrin's paper, and the order of these papers is not accidental in that they sort of build on each other in a certain way. Darrin gives us the philosophe in conflict with one another about the science of genius, the value of genius, even the existence of genius. All of this reminded me, as it might have reminded some of you, about contemporary arguments in schools about things like tracking and gifted and talented programs, in which really these exact same arguments are reproduced in new form. But Darrin sets these arguments in a larger intellectual problematic, the simultaneous development of two discourses that he sees these writers as at some level trying to resolve, either for themselves or really for us in posterity. One is the language of equality or equity, by which I think he means largely equality of rights or equality before the law. It's a little ambiguous in some of the formulations, and maybe you can clarify for that. But this idea of some notion of equality that's central to modern liberal regimes, combined with the idea of the great man who's somehow beyond the law, exceptional in every sense, the natural aristocrat who is free to break the rules of convention, an idea that Darrin interestingly hints comes to its culmination in Napoleon, in a sense, replacing not only the notion of king, but in some ways the notion of pope as well, a kind of substitute in the form of genius. I'm not entirely persuaded by this opposition. One might say that the modern era simply substitutes one system of social distinctions or inequalities for another, that equality, especially in the era of the philosophe, is not even yet a legal fiction. It's too much of an abstraction to be the counterpart to genius. That's something one might want to discuss. And one might say genius is more in tension with populism, the emerging idea of the collective wisdom of ordinary people that would trump that of experts or geniuses, rather than in tension with equality as either a political position or an epistemological or biological foundation. But Darrin's paper has the remarkable virtue of having us thinking in very broad terms about a problem that is central to this organization of modern life, and that's no small achievement in a 10-page, 25-minute talk. Tony's paper doesn't disagree. Tony doesn't disagree that the philosophe's musings, especially those of Diderot, give us some kind of privileged access to the social imaginary of the moment, or at least the social imaginary of one exceptional author in a larger culture. But Tony disagrees about what this social imaginary looks like, and also how we might get to the point of knowing what this social imaginary looks like. Arguing less for the longue durée story of the fate of an idea, and more for the deep reading of particular texts focused on what I take to be a series of sort of ever-expanding frameworks, which is to say very close up in biography, slightly larger into intellectual or political fashions, and then slightly larger again into some kind of rhetorical context that links outward to other texts, but also back to the author. Tony claims Diderot had something different in mind than this problem of equality. Rather than worry excessively about the specter of mass conformity down the line, not yet apparent on the stage, he has Diderot worried about aristocratic culture in his position in relation to Le Monde, to a hierarchy of emulation that infects social relations at every stage, to the realm of imagination associated with femininity, all of which are in a sense linked to one another. And so, as I read or hear Tony's paper, from this slightly less Olympian height, he takes Diderot's concern with genius to have less to do with an anticipated modern discourse of equality of rights, and more to do with his own insecurities and biases in the culture of the old regime and its many class and gendered dimensions. And I think that's a highly plausible reading of these texts, Diderot and genius, but it doesn't necessarily in any way negate what Darrin has to say, as Tony points out, which is to say that it is highly possible that Diderot had one thing in mind, but the implications of what he had to say and the effects were quite different, that he could have been responding to aristocratic culture, but the significance of what he had to say was how it was to fit within another emerging social imaginary with which it was in tension. And sometimes the effects of discourse turn out to be more important in the long run than the intentions of the author at the time of composition. Antoine's answer is to therefore change the question, which is to say that rather than take up the great man in the form of the genius, he takes up the emergence of a subtly different social type or phenomenon, of which Rousseau, rather than Diderot, becomes one of the first great exemplars and analysts, that is the celebrity, the famous writer celebrated in his own lifetime. Like Darrin, Antoine sees this figure as part of a new social vision. In this case, though, not the flip side of the emergence of equality, but the flip side of the emergence of something like a public that exalts this celebrity from some kind of distance. And like Tony, Antoine is interested in how this relationship is made possible in the mediated form of texts, though he appears to be less interested in this question of how texts mediate between author and ideas, and more between author and audience, or this public. And Antoine's celebrity, as particularly exemplified by Chateaubriand, is deeply torn. He's worried about becoming vain, but he's also worried about whether he's alienated and lost his authentic self. He's worried about public judgment and fashion, and whether they're legitimate sources of legitimacy. Here we have Chateaubriand as the first member of the avant-garde. And in all three papers, we get a psychologically conflicted, one might say, example of the great man in some form, grappling with the possibilities of his own social position in a moment when that is being redefined and increasingly insecure. So what do we do with them? The question I think that Tony posed for us is, can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Is there some way to put these together? And I'd say the answer lies perhaps in something that all three papers actually insist upon, which is that to different degrees, the genius or the celebrity or the great man only exists at all if in tension with something else. That it always, in a sense, has to be recognized by its opposite for it to be a phenomenon at all. Whether that opposite is the mass of ordinary people, aristocrats, an abstraction called the public, or simply readers. And I would say, therefore, that both Darrin's big, bold ideas and the close, psychologically acute, contextual readings of Tony and Antoine only really come full circle then if we added in some notion of the reception of these ideas, some notion of how the social imaginary reads from the other side of this binary. I think that is true at the level of concept, and of course all of these people have written extensively on this subject, which is not to say that they haven't thought of this before. Simply in the papers as they're presented, we get one side of this binary. But that audience matters both for the conceptual work of thinking about the new position of the exceptional man, and they matter at the level of method, which is to say, even Tony's rhetorical performances depend on an audience. A performance without an audience, implied or actual, ceases to be some kind of performance. And so, rather than go on at greater length, I think that what I will do is ask our own esteemed authors to respond, and then ask them to quickly turn to their esteemed audience and ask for the response. Thank you.
Actually, we should go up here, if that's okay.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Even though the panelists have been introduced already, before you speak, perhaps you can give your name again for the record.
You're going to sit here.
So how are we going to do this? You have to sit down, Antoine. You can't loom over us, you know. It's unfair.
The great man.
The great man, yes.
I think you have an opportunity to reply, and then we'll open the session to some other questions, if you want to.
I mean, I'll just say really quickly, and then we can go on. You know, Tony and I have a conversation, and you know, I think my quick response is to agree with Tony that we're really not all that far apart. And I mean, you mentioned Peter Gordon and I, but the other figure here trying to do what we're trying to do, a new kind of refashioned history and ideas, is David Armitage, who of course is, you know, a Quentin Skinner student and trained in a kind of contextual history that I think is very much similar to your own. And what David would talk about is the attempt to do a kind of new history ideas as a series of serial contextualisms, and that one links them up over the longue durée. I would also point out that, you know, I think the opposition between a history and ideas done by somebody like Lovejoy and Skinnerian and Pokakian contextualism is often a false dichotomy. I think you can argue that Skinner's sort of caricature of Lovejoy is just that. I mean, if you go back and you read Lovejoy's famous essay on the history of ideas, when he takes, you know, the one example of how would you read a poem by Milton, and he chronicles, 12 or 13 discourses that one would have to see intersecting to read Milton very carefully in order to do that well. My point being that I think that history and ideas and kind of close contextual readings can very much go together. I think they go together in somebody like Pocock. Obviously, Machiavellian Moment is a history of the longue durée. I think that Skinner's Liberty Before Liberalism is that, his history of the state and so forth. But it's a question of perspective, right? If you fly over a landscape at 30,000 feet, you're going to see features of the land that look a certain way, and that will be different from when you're there close on the ground. I think that one has to constantly be in dialogue back and forth in order to make these two visions come together. The other point I'll just make quickly, I think that Sophie mentioned at the end, reception. I couldn't agree more, and indeed, I mean, my book really is less a book about geniuses talking about geniuses. It's about publics talking about geniuses, and I think this is why the figure of Napoleon that I just allude to and I talk about some at length in the book, and then later Hitler, strangely, are so astute in that they can tap into a kind of discourse of genius and manipulate it in terms of the public reception of that. So I couldn't agree again more. So not enough disagreement, but that'll come out in due course.
Okay, well, this was a very rich comment. Thank you. I think the notion of the collective wisdom of ordinary people is a very good one, and it really helped me because in dealing with Darrin's argument, I was dubious about the notion that in the 18th century, at least until the Revolution, people like Diderot are worrying about equality in the sense of, well, certainly in the sense of social equality. I don't think he had any notion of that whatsoever, or even legal equality. It's just not. It doesn't seem to enter into his thinking very much, at least in the context of genius. But the collective wisdom of ordinary people. That's something I think that which is, I suppose, a form of equality, but a much more informal notion. Yeah, I think that's something that he was concerned about, and he was concerned about it. It ties in with his concern about conformism. Unfortunately for him, from his point of view, the collective wisdom of ordinary people is a nightmare because it's everyone conforming, and he did believe in what I would call individuality, which increasingly for him was biologically based. It was organic. Okay, I think your suggestion about genius and its opposites is terrific. And I think where Darrin and I actually disagree is precisely on that. When Diderot or any of a number of other people are formulating a concept of genius, what is the opposite they have in mind? And what I'm suggesting is that the opposite, the closest and most immediate opposite, is aristocratic culture. Not just in the sense of, as we usually think of it, as an elite of wealth or of birth, but as an aesthetic, which is an aesthetic without the appearance of labor. And so Diderot is constantly trying to figure out how one can labor and be a genius at the same time. Always, I think, with at the back of his mind, the figure of the pedant, who is the figure who labors too much, or does rote labor, meaningless labor. And I'll just say that yes, reception is hugely important. My notion of a rhetorical approach, that's where it starts really. The first context is audience, either the real audience or the audience imagined. And one of the fascinating things about people like Diderot was that he had a lot of trouble figuring out who his audience was. He often, in the same text, will shift from one audience to another. So.
Rapidement, alors merci, oui, c'était vraiment un commentaire très pertinent. Pour bien y répondre, je vais peut-être préciser ce que je n'ai pas fait, que le texte là, en fait, est un élément d'un projet plus large sur la célébrité, qui est un livre que je viens de terminer, qui paraîtra en septembre, c'est un petit moment de publicité, mais j'ai pas amené les flyers, mais non, et donc c'est important parce que le livre que j'ai écrit sur la célébrité de 1750 à 1850 n'est pas un livre d'histoire intellectuelle, c'est pas un livre sur l'idée de célébrité. C'est là que j'ai c'est assez différent de ce point de vue-là, même s'il y a beaucoup de points de rencontre avec le travail de Darrin. C'est un livre sur la célébrité comme phénomène social et culturel. Et dans lequel, notamment, j'étudie, alors, pas forcément les réponses à ces textes, mais par exemple la multiplication des portraits dans l'espace public, des formes de biographie, des correspondances, donc toute une série de phénomènes sociaux. Mais, et c'est là que je pense qu'il y a une évolution méthodologique par rapport à l'histoire sociale ou culturelle, je considère que la façon dont ce phénomène social est pensé par les contemporains est un élément absolument essentiel de sa signification et de son évolution. Donc, là où je m'intéresse aux idées sur la célébrité, à la manière dont la célébrité est décrite, pensée, commentée, et notamment dans cette pensée, dans cette ambivalence que j'ai essayé de mettre en évidence, c'est là ça me rapproche effectivement du type de travail. C'est pour ça que c'est ça que j'ai sélectionné, choisi aujourd'hui pour être davantage en dialogue avec Tony et Darrin. Mais ce qui compte là, c'est en quelque sorte c'est une histoire intellectuelle du social. C'est la manière dont, pas simplement d'ailleurs les grands écrivains, parce que là j'ai choisi Chateaubriand et Rousseau, mais c'est aussi par exemple très intéressant la manière dont la presse commente et justifie par exemple le fait de parler de la vie privée des hommes célèbres. Si vous prenez les mémoires secrets, pour prendre un exemple français, vous trouverez pareil dans The Gentleman Magazine par exemple, vous avez en permanence non seulement des commentaires sur la vie des personnes célèbres, mais des commentaires justifiant le fait de raconter la vie des personnes célèbres, y compris avec des argumentaires qui ne sont pas très différents de ceux qu'on trouve aujourd'hui sur la presse People. Par exemple, au moment où on raconte la vie privée d'actrices ou d'écrivains en disant eux-mêmes, puisqu'ils sont célèbres, en fait, ils veulent le bruit public et donc ils acceptent qu'on raconte des tas de choses publiquement sur eux. Donc ce type d'argumentaire. Mais voilà, donc il y a différents. Donc pour répondre à la question, c'est pas tant que je vais essayer de comprendre la réception de ces textes-là, même si ce qui m'intéresse, c'est la consolidation d'un imaginaire par l'intertextualité, que de saisir plusieurs niveaux de discours, ceux des écrivains eux-mêmes, ceux des lecteurs qui leur écrivent, ceux de la presse, etc., pour essayer de montrer comment le degré de réflexivité à différents niveaux du discours social par rapport à une mutation qui est donc la manière dont on lui donne sens, aussi bien ceux qui en font l'objet que ceux qui sont en position de le commenter. Voilà, c'est comme ça que j'articulerai l'histoire intellectuelle que je produis avec une histoire sociale.
Okay, I guess I'll recognize people. Carla Hesse?
Yeah, these were wonderful papers.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, these were wonderful papers.
I'm supposed to push something. I don't know. Okay. I guess this question is sort of for Darrin, but I think it picks up off of Tony's wonderful, I think, formulation of the problem of genius as a rhetorical figure. But it's sort of a methodological question in the sense that you can pick Tocqueville as your point de départ, or you could pick Marx. And that's a choice, and it has rhetorical, I think, significance. So if we think about Marx's 1848 manuscripts, which I was thinking about the whole time you were speaking, you know, that what defines the species being is the capacity not to repeat ourselves, and that has become the mantra of our new knowledge economy, with real political consequences that have less to do with the formal character of democracy in the sense of equality, but the social power of who controls knowledge and how knowledge circulates. So I'm wondering, you know, when making this sort of how one makes those methodological choices and how you frame the rhetorical question of genius. So Marx has an answer. He thinks a lot about intellectual property and the social production of knowledge, as does Bourdieu in his famous essay Qui a créé le créateur, which is in some ways an homage to the early Marx. But I raise that because, you know, one way to write this story is really about, you know, a drift from the 18th century to the present that is about the privatization of genius, not its, and its, you know, evil doppelganger, the celebrity, which, you know, has led to an economy in which I think actually the civic and social obligations of genius, you know, have given way to, you know, a world in which we think of this as purely a private good. Genius is now, in fact, a private good, and it's owned and traded as a good. So I just wonder, in writing a history of the rhetorical dimensions of genius, you know, how you frame your own set of choices in the way in which you formulate the question.
I don't know if I can answer it, Carla, you know, like this quickly. I mean, Tocqueville, as I said, I came to him late, actually, after kind of working through this material. And one of the things that was really striking to me, particularly in the 19th century, is a reference to Sophie's point, that the singular individual is always measured against something else. And that something else, as it develops in statistics in the 19th century with KETE and then with Galton, is something like average man, like the normal person, right? And you know, literally you get a bell curve, right, with Galton. And so at the extreme of the bell curve, 2 standard deviations away from the norm is the genius, and then on the other hand is always, you know, the undesirables, less than average, right? And so the kind of science of genius that develops in the 19th century, I call genealogy, which begins with phrenology and then and physiognomy, and then, you know, goes through craniology and ultimately ends in the IQ exam, is about, yes, privileging these kind of special individuals over and against a norm. Now, as you say, Marx has a fundamental critique of that, and in fact, a very explicit one. I mean, he laughs at Carlyle's sort of glorification of this special individual. But I think that glorification goes on and has really important ideological consequences, because the genius then can be presented as this figure who is fundamentally distinct and unlike the masses and the ordinary person. I mean, the same thing actually happens so interestingly with Marx. I talk about the cult of Marx's genius, or the cult then that Lenin uses, which is such a fundamentally un-Marxian move, right, to glorify the single individual, and yet this happens. I mean, it happens at Highgate Cemetery after Marx is even, you know, he doesn't, not even cold in the grave. To answer your question, on one level, I was sort of, I think, trying to respond to the material. The way Tocqueville comes into it is in the contemporary world. I mean, we use the term in America now, genius, all the time, to refer to absolutely everyone. I mean, you know, there's the Genius Bar at the Apple Store. I have a whole series of titles in the PowerPoint that I do that, you know, there's David Shank wrote a best-selling book, The Genius in All of Us. We no longer have unitary intelligence, we have multiple intelligence, we have emotional intelligence. All of us have a genius for something. And so to me, that's the kind of Tocquevillian dynamic at play here. Equality ultimately kind of trumping this notion of the special individual, although at the same time enshrining it in, you know, somebody like a Steve Jobs, who is you know, held up as a modern image of genius. I think, you know, well, that's a whole other discussion. But you know, I don't think that I made an ideological choice at the outset, you know, to privilege one discussion over another.
Let me just say, I think you made a historical claim. And the historical claim was that the tradition from Hobbes through Helvetius, drawing on the Longinus, loses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it's a methodological question about how you frame, you know, the truth status of that,
sure,
that claim. And I guess I'm asking this as a, and then, you know, what the interpretive
Okay.
the interpretive project is.
Well, I'm actually very sympathetic to that position. I mean, actually, I mentioned Anders Ericsson, who's a modern Helvetian, and I think, that people really are fundamentally more equal than a discourse of genius would ever lead one to believe. But it does lose, I think. I think it loses. I think actually, again, Marx is the example of it, how it loses. Marx, who wants to claim a basic equality, is raised up and made a god, right, and a prophet figure, very much in keeping with this ideology of genius that develops in the 19th century. Is treated as such, and Lenin is very conscious of that, and even more so as Stalin, who uses the mystique of the special individual to do terrible things.
Yeah, but okay, I'm just shut up after that.
Okay.
But, the opposite side of that is that there's always been a limit to the claims that genius can make. In fact, Hitler doesn't win, Napoleon doesn't win.
Right.
Something else wins. So that's something else, I think, is the limits.
Well, thankfully.
Or you can look at it,
Yeah.
the limits of intellectual property claims of an individual on the products of their knowledge. There's another story to tell there.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm not sure that it wins.
Oh, I don't think it does either. Well, I mean, we'll continue, but yeah. Cool.
We've actually run out of time. Is that true, David?
The next session starts in 4 minutes.
Oh, right. I think we've run out of time.
Oh my gosh.
Afterwards. Thank you very much.